Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. Today we are here with Michael Fletcher of the ESPN Enterprise Reporting Team, and we want to talk to you today, Michael. Thank you for coming on the program. But we wanted to talk to you today about your origin story, how you kind of built your career as a journalist and sort of the 5 dubs of how you became a journalist. So welcome.
Oh, good to be here, Sam. I'm saying Sam, Rebecca. I'm thinking of your
Sam's
producer.
our behind-the-scenes producer, so she
right.
really does sort of.
She did. I'm told she does all the fancy stuff.
She does. All right. So, but I feel like your world didn't start off as the fancy ESPN reporting. Tell us a little bit about, what you do now, because I think our listeners may not be aware of the intersection of policy and sports and sort of what you bring now at ESPN, and then we'll go in the Wayback Machine and figure out how you got there.
No, absolutely. As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm part of ESPN's investigative/enterprise team, and I came to ESPN, not as a sports writer, and I'm basically don't think of myself as a sports writer now. A lot of the stories I do intersect with sports, but really have more to do either with politics or business or racial justice and issues like that. And I try to sort of patrol that intersection of sports with those other issues and kind of the social waves that we see moving through our society. So it's a fun job, and it's an interesting job. There's obviously a lot of terrain there to investigate and write about. But I'm not the guy sitting at the press table at a game, or marking out every basket and whether someone shot off the left hand or right hand. I don't do that at all.
So, but writing for that national audience, and certainly you were a writer for many years at the Washington Post, so sort of that national aspect. But sports is such big business in the U.S., and in many ways, those deals are groundbreaking. What are some of the interesting things that you feel like you've uncovered or worked on it's been 3 years, right? Just about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, 3 years on this staff. And before then I was at kind of an ESPN vertical called The Undefeated, which kind of focused squarely on the intersection of race, sports, and culture. And you're right, Rebecca. I knew this, but in a way I didn't. I didn't really realize how deep this goes. There's so much interest in our society in sports and in celebrity, which kind of they're intertwined, obviously.
Right.
And some of the audiences we get for stories we do are incredible. I worked, as you mentioned, many years at the Washington Post. I covered the White House. I helped co-author a book about Justice Thomas of the Supreme Court. But all of that stuff, while it had, some interest, it's nothing like sports. Just recently, I did a story about Michael Orr, the former Baltimore Raven football player who was made famous by the movie The Blind Side, and he filed a petition against his what purportedly adoptive family, sort of seeking to end this conservatorship. It wasn't an adoption; he was actually in a conservatorship with the family. And he feels like the family profited from the movie in ways that he did not. So I kind of followed that whole, I sort of broke the story about his filing, and has been following that story since. But it's incredible the amount of page views they got. I'm not one to follow that stuff because, mainly because I don't want to take responsibility for when no one reads the story. So I don't.
You want to be about the work. I get it.
And you need to be about the work because it's. That's the only way to get out of your head. Like otherwise, you get kind of confused, right? But millions and millions of people, 11 million page views, which is like,
That's
it's a big number. It's like huge, right? And I'm thinking, well, okay, The Blind Side, okay, it was a big movie, I get it,
right?
But it was in 2009. Michael Orr is not like Tom Brady, it's not like celebrity to that level. But it gets to your point that it touched a nerve in America because it's sports, it's celebrity, there's a racial element
Hmm.
to it, and these are all obviously hot buttons in our society. So I
Well,
do stuff like that. I've written about Colin Kaepernick's
mhm.
protests and kind of like in kind of the immediate aftermath of his being blackballed. Talked about I did a big piece about kind of what he was doing with his career, which was interesting because he doesn't talk to the press, so you had to like report all around him, and I mean, he's into iconography. He's into his whole thing, and I was trying to sort of like describe that. It was an interesting reporting enterprise. But again, another huge audience. I did it before one of the Super Bowls, and again, I knew this before going to ESPN and kind of writing in this area, but the impact of it is still a little surprising.
Sure, it's one thing to know it intellectually and then to see those page views and think, well, gosh, the White House is not chopped liver. Like but it's sports is a really great vehicle to talk about all these intersections. I mean, with Michael Orr, you get into um, power dynamics and class dynamics as well as the racial piece of it, and as well as how sports is used as a way out for
Right.
so many people and what that does to them.
Yeah.
But it didn't all start at sports. So you had said earlier that you don't really see yourself as a sports reporter. And before we started recording, you were talking a little bit about how you didn't see yourself even as a journalist until college. And granted, so when you scratch the surface of many reporters, they'll say, "Oh, well, I wrote for my high school newspaper, or I did this, or I did that." What were you doing in high school? Because you had intimated that you were not writing for the
I know, I
paper.
know. I was having a good time, but also, I thought at one point I thought I wanted to be an engineer as a kid coming up. Right, I grew up in New York City. I went to a high school called Brooklyn Tech, and
Hmm.
it was all about math and science. I even had a slide rule in high school. This is going back before calculators. Calculators were new, and I think they cost $100, which was beyond my family budget at the time. My mother and father looked at me like I was crazy when I asked for one. So I actually know how to multiply on my slide rule and stuff like that,
And
and
you could
do
probably do
square.
math in your head, which is like next level
Yeah, I could
amazing.
do like a little. I could do like arithmetic, all that stuff, times tables. I could kind of multiply big numbers pretty well in my head. But but I realized I was smart enough to realize in the high school that okay, I'm doing this and I got good grades and all of that. But I realized it wasn't a passion, right? I
Hmm.
knew that what, once I leave class, I never ever pick up an engineering magazine in those days or engineering journal. I didn't know any engineers, and I figured, I'm just not that interested in this, maybe.
Hmm.
But I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it's funny, I had the good fortune, I applied to Boston University, and then these are the days before like college admissions were like this crazy game it
Right.
is now. Like my parents, hadn't gone to college. So they didn't know anything about this. They were kind of like, you go to college. And like I said, I grew up in New York City. And in those days, the City University in New York was tuition free. So I always knew I
Hmm.
could go there. And you would get in, it was kind of open admissions and had good grades, but you would have gotten to one of the schools. But I wanted to get out of New York. And
Sure.
my brother happened to have a friend who went to Boston University. And so I applied to be not because of the great academic program, but because I knew someone who went there. And it
But
didn't even
isn't that
know.
amazing? Like once you
Yeah.
see a path, like you just need one person to say, "Oh, look, I've done that," and it kind of unlocks things
And
that you
unlocked.
that
Yeah.
you wouldn't have expected.
Then I remember I went to visit him. Me and two friends of mine from high school. I remember we took the train to Boston. And who does this? Like we went to visit a college like on a Friday. I think
Hmm.
Friday after school. I want to say it was a Friday, the Saturday morning. I think it was a Friday evening. We took the train to Boston. And we spent the weekend in Boston, slept in my brother's in the basement of their dormitory, my brother's friend's dormitory basement, and like went to parties, had all this good time. And then Monday morning comes around, and I realized, well, what have I done? I saw the campus kind of, but I haven't talked to anybody.
Hmm.
So I had the instinct to, well, go to the admissions office. Did I have an appointment? No. I went to the admissions office,
You're
but
just
I
there.
had applied. I think at that point I might have been admitted, and I had applied to the school as an undeclared major. I would for the
Okay.
College of Liberal Arts because I didn't know what I
Hmm.
wanted to do. And I had the good fortune of an admissions officer coming down and talking to me about my interest. They saw my application and my SAT scores and all of this stuff. And this person sort of walked through my interests. What do you like doing? What do you like? What intrigues you? What's the most fascinating subject in school? And I remember if I remember this correctly, I talked to him about what we used to call back in the day current events.
Hmm.
And I always enjoyed that. And I enjoyed kind of policy debates. I remember in social studies classes talking about stuff that was going on in the city, and we talk about what's in the paper.
Hmm.
And so I kind of came at it that way. And so we had this conversation, and then he kind of ran through the various programs at Boston University. He said, you ever think about going to the School of Public Communication?
Hmm.
And I don't think I had heard of it, to be honest, because I didn't admit that to the guy. But
Well, yeah.
I said, no. And he essentially talked me through that. He said, it sounds like it would match your interest. And the clincher for me was, he said, look, you have the grades to get into SPC now. That's good. And he says, if you go there for 2 years and you decide to say you don't like it and transfer to liberal arts, you wouldn't lose time in school. But to
Sure.
do the reverse, you'd lose time in school. So that was like a clinching argument for me. I said,
Right. No, that
well,
makes
I'll do
perfect
that,
sense.
and like in those days, thank goodness, I remember Boston University had to cost $5,000 a year, and it seemed like all the money in the world, right? Like, where am
If
I
you
going to
don't
get
have
that?
it,
But
yes, it is all the money
yeah,
in the
but in
world.
those days, federal student aid covered most of that.
Oh, good.
I got a little money from Boston University, had a work study job, and I was able to put together a package that basically paid my way to college. And I went there, went to the School of Public Communication, and when I got to BU, I made friends with some people who kind of knew they wanted to be student journalists, and ended up becoming the editor of a Black student newspaper at Boston University called Black Folk.
Hmm.
And that was the first time I'd ever written for any kind of publication. I didn't know how to write a news story. I mean, I knew how to write. I get enough grades and all of that. I used to read, and I kind of learned on the job, if you will, how to write news stories. But I was fascinated from the beginning. It was nothing like that rush of like walking through, say, the student union after the paper had come out, and you see people sort of reading the paper, and they had no idea that, I've written one of those articles, or they might have been written an article you wrote. And there was something about the feeling of kind of having a public conversation without
Mm.
people knowing that they were having it with you, that I found just totally enthralling, and I knew then that I wanted to be in the business.
And I think having that spark, knowing that you're sparking an idea or a change or a different view in someone, that is exhilarating.
Yeah.
And knowing that your words and your perspective can really provide that shift must have been a really um, just fascinating feeling if you'd
Oh
never
yeah.
done it before.
Yeah, but and the other part of it was the access you had to people. Like, I remember we interviewed the president of the university, John Silver, at the time, and he was this kind of foreboding figure, John Silver. He was kind of a strict, kind of real hardline kind of guy. He later ran for governor of Massachusetts, and it hits you like, this journalism things, like it's like a passport to the world. Like, you can talk to the powerful, right? And you don't have to be right about everything. You go there. God knows, I would probably hate to hear a transcript of like kind of the conversation right now. I'd probably cringe,
Right.
but we did a story which was fine. And I think he even responded to in some way. And I can't remember what it said, but again, it was like that sort of access to kind of power and people who were making decisions that affected your life, that felt, it felt good. It felt like you can make a difference, and you
Mhm.
could, it's cliche, but it felt like you could speak up for the voiceless and things like that.
Right. And so,
Yeah.
like your questions are going to be other people's questions, and just sort of you're that messenger in some way to get that word out. That's very exhilarating.
Yep.
So
Yes.
then you were the editor of the Black student newspaper, and then did you go straight to the Baltimore Sun, or did you
Oh
kind
no!
of?
Like, my first job at school was funny. In those days, I remember, and there were a couple of editors. Actually, one of my buddies, one of my best friends, he was my roommate. We were kind of co-editors. He's now, like, life is funny. He's now like the executive editor of the LA Times. So we went from Black Folk to all of this stuff. But I remember when I was about to graduate college, I didn't have a job lined up. Right.
Mm,
I remember sitting
how
in then my
scary.
studio apartment in Boston, Boylston, I was on Boylston Street, I'll never forget. And in those days, you had to have photocopies of your clips. And I had,
Mhm.
done a little freelancing here and there, but nothing major. I didn't have any major internships. I just didn't have what they call social capital now. Like, I didn't know how important it was. I'm thinking, I need to go back to New York every summer and work
Sure.
and live home, save more money so I can go back to school. I'm thinking
Well,
along
yeah.
those
I
lines.
mean, those are issues of survival, not
Yeah,
survival, but like, that's what you needed to do to stay in school. And it
right.
is really hard to think about, okay, how am I building this, like thinking so long term to build that career?
No, absolutely. It's the kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, of course, I told my children otherwise. Like I said, that little money you'll make in the summer, and those, what was it like? If I saved $1,200 over the summer, like it was like, but nonetheless, I saw that as important. So I didn't have a job lined up, but I remember sitting in that apartment with the Xeroxes of my resume and my little package of 8 to 10 clips and typing cover letters and like, damn, you get to the last line, there's a typo or something.
Oh, I hate that.
And then in those days, it was like it was a typewriter, and you have to start all over again. And I remember mailing out packages like probably 30 packages like to papers like in these mid-sized cities, Charleston, Richmond, Virginia, uh,
Hmm. So you were
on
willing
and
to kind of
on.
go anywhere then, it
Yeah,
sounds
and
like.
then I'm from New York. New York papers aren't going to hire a kid out of
Right.
school if they don't know you. I wasn't known in the newsroom. I never walked through the doors in the New York Times or in those days of Daily News. I used to deliver the paper as a kid, but that was as close as I had gotten. So anyway, I applied everywhere. I ended up getting a job with Gannett,
Mm.
and it paid like next to nothing. I'll never forget that. It was like, I mean, I'll say the salary here's a joke. It was $190 a week. I remember that
Ouch.
distinctly. This is 79, so it's not, it's not 59, so
Right.
it's, that was still like, that was no money then.
Right.
And because I had friends I'd grown up with who, sort of work for the city, become bus drivers, things like they're making more money than me, and I'd gone to college and all this stuff.
Hmm.
But I knew I wanted to do this thing. So I ended up getting a job not that far from New York City. I was able to live at home for a year or two, and I was working in New Jersey. Remember,
Mm.
I'd never owned a car before. I had to buy a car. And I would drive 53 miles, remember that, from our home in Queens, New York to central New Jersey to this newspaper, and every day, 53 miles. I remember that little Fiat I bought, a little box Fiat. That thing, sometimes, if you didn't get a good running start up the Verrazano Bridge, like it feels like it might roll back. It was, you needed it wouldn't. You could get to 40 going uphill. It would go 70 downhill, but you know. But I did that. So my first job was at the Courier News in central New Jersey. I covered a town called Plainfield, and it
Hmm.
was a great experience. I mean, I just learned so many things. Again, it's this idea of talking to the powerful. I got to know the city councilman in Plainfield, the police leadership, the mayor, civic leaders in town. We wrote all kinds of stories about that city, which was kind of in its own way a microcosm of urban America, because it was kind of a
Hmm.
struggling city, had its share of issues, and it was small, so you can get your arms around it. You get to know the players, but the dynamics really aren't that different than what you see in New York or other cities. I've covered Baltimore and Washington, D.C. It was the same kind of dynamic, but it was such a valuable experience. And the lack of money, feels like at least in retrospect, doesn't feel like a big deal. At the time, though, I remember at one point I got an apartment at Plainfield, and I guess the landlady didn't like always want to buy heating oil, and it was like a couple of cold nights
Oh,
and
extra
things like
sweater time for
yeah,
sure.
exactly. But I wouldn't trade it for the world. It was such a great experience.
Well, and it sounds like a great experience because when you can kind of wrap your arms around like the whole ecosystem, and you can do that, I think, in a smaller town, whereas, yeah, it's just sort of a scale thing when you get to larger places.
Absolutely.
I think if you don't recognize going in that, you know, everything is sort of just a different scale when you get to the big time, but you still have, like the interplay, the dynamics, the politics. It
Yes.
sounds like in some ways that really sets you up for that and like your initial thoughts about engineering. I feel like engineering is all about putting things in their places and like getting a taxonomy and sort of process, which
Hmm.
is so helpful as a reporter.
Yeah.
And like in many respects, I don't think the discipline of like the act of reporting is given enough credence because you got to know where all your FOIA requests are. You got to know like all your sources. Can you talk a little bit about just, how you have kind of taken that passion for talking to a lot of people and then just been able to distill it with enough rigor and discipline to get the product out the door? Because I think that's
I
hard.
mean, it's funny. That's been a process, right? And you really because I've learned so much through the years, you almost forget what you didn't know. You talk about FOIA requests. Like I probably was, embarrassed to say, probably was a reporter for like 2 or 3 years before I ever filed one. Because I didn't quite
Are you
know.
still
I
waiting
mean,
on that one? Because that's the other problem,
right? I know that's the thing. I know. I always, I thought, oh God, you file this thing, then they're going to give you 10 boxes of documents, and you're not going to know what to do with them. There's so much that you just learn on the job. And when I talk to young journalists now, I encourage them to just embrace. So many of us want to look to kind of our goal to the future. I'm like, embrace the moment, like, and take advantage of what's right in front of you, because there's so much right in front of you. And I think that's what I was able to do. And there were a lot of fits and starts and mistakes. I'm not going to deny any of that. But
hmm
at the end of the day, you kind of learn what you need to do. You learn the process that works for you. You learn how to become, because I talk about engineering, but I don't like disorganized and, I used to have an editor at the Post who wrote a book. He was like a top editor, and he wrote a book in the morning. How do you do this, Steve? He said, well, only touch the document once. And so if you touch the document once, I would touch it 4 times, because I couldn't, because I didn't, whatever, annotate it right the first time, or didn't cross-reference it, or didn't. But eventually, you kind of learn, and you kind of learn what you're looking for. But if I had an instinct, it was always the one that served well, at least, was I always thought about, even in the most, I don't know, Byzantine sort of meeting or process of government, I always thought about things from kind of outside in, like what do the citizens think? What do people
Right.
think? What did I think before I was in this business? Like kind of like the baseline where the rubber hits the road kind of perspective I tried to bring to my work. And I think that's been helpful to me. I never saw myself as part of the machine, if you will, even if I was in some ways, but I always tried to bring that outsider perspective and
But I
try to
feel like that
understand
makes
things from the ground up.
your writing so relatable because you're bringing that sort of aspect. You don't feel like, oh, I have to know all the intricacies of that. It's not like the inside that you need to have read 4 books before you understand what you're talking about. Like I think you have a real gift for relating complex issues out to the general public. And maybe it is that aspect of like, I remember when I didn't know anything about this,
Right.
and I'm bringing that perspective or idea in.
Right. And it sounds so basic, but it's a hard thing to stick to too, because there is a thing like in our business where you end up writing for your sources. You're like, people want to seem like, well, I'm so well informed that I'm going to like impress the people I
Right.
interviewed for the story. There's a little bit of that, and I'm sure no one would say it that way, but I think that does happen, and
Mhm.
you have to resist that. Like, I want to look smart to them. You really want to be relatable to your audience, and you want to write for your audience. And it's okay if you don't know everything, or if you ask a very basic question, even if you think you know the answer. Just to hear how it's related, to
Mhm.
you. So you try to hold on to those things and remember you kind of remember your role. Like I'm the people's person in this meeting or in this process or,
Mhm.
in this job. If I'm at a Supreme Court oral argument, like people are working, they don't have time for this. I'm here, I'm there, I'm their ears for this thing. You have to, so you want to relate it to them in terms that they would understand, not for the law clerks or whoever, you might meet in your rounds of things.
Right. Well, and it occurs to me, we talk at the Press Association a lot about why journalism is important. And to me, from what you've said, like you're the stand-in for the public, you're the eyes and ears for people who don't have time to trot on down to, that meeting or don't have the access to interview that person. Um, and I think that's a really important role. But I'm curious, like, why do you think journalism is important?
I mean, you just said a lot of it, but I also think it's and again, you sort of fall into these cliches, but it's really true. I mean, we're like the people who inform the public, and we play such an integral role in how our government is supposed to work, right? I mean, and people, I hear people all the time say, "Oh, politicians, they don't care about us. They don't care about what people think." I'm like, actually, quite to the contrary. Like they're hypersensitive to like public demands. Like you could have 10 people organized, like even a city the size of Baltimore, and the mayor's going to respond if there are 10 people are kind of working,
Hmm.
in unison. But if you don't organize, you don't respond, they don't respond because they don't hear you, they don't see you. You know what I mean? So I think we catalyze that as journalists. So we're the ones who are bringing the information, who are framing problems, who are breaking complex issues down into sort of to a level where people can wrap their minds around them and kind of see their role in them and see whether they're well served or not by this or that thing.
Hmm.
So I mean, we're almost like translate this very complex and necessarily so. People think it's just a gobbledygook, but there's a reason government's the way it is. But we kind of translate that to to the average people.
Hmm. That makes perfect sense. And it's so critical because not as many people engage in the political process, but it has a huge effect on our everyday lives. And if you stand up and can feel like you know what you can talk, what you're talking about, it's, it is you can make massive change. But if you don't have someone to translate it, it can get, you can just get in the weeds, I think.
Right, right. It's empowering when you know stuff, right? Like people feel like they understand something. They it sort of sharpens their conviction, and it just makes people feel like, hey, I can, what? That's wrong. I can make a difference. It makes things kind of brings clarity to what feels like just this blob of information or not even
Mm,
information. It feels like just a cloud of ongoing whatever. I think to average people like government and all the back and forth and all of the blah, blah, blah. But like it's, has the effect of like numbing people, right? And if you can
it
cut
does.
through that, and you're not going to do it all the time, and you like to, but you try to cut through it. And when you do effectively, you really see the impact of that, and that's
Mm,
empowering for journalists, and of course, it's empowering for for voters and the citizenry.
absolutely. Well, and because this is sort of our one part of our origin series, I wanted to end with asking you, 1979 is a long time ago. If you were advising, and I feel like you do talk to young reporters a lot, and advise, what what would be your sort of crystallizing piece of advice for someone who maybe doesn't see themselves as a journalist, but maybe likes to know things? What would you tell promising young potential journalists today?
I mean, I think the number one thing you can do in this business is persevere. Be persistent. It wasn't always clear. I started, as I mentioned, at the Courier News in central New Jersey, making a buck 90 a week. Which is nothing. I remember I got the courage up to ask the publisher. I said, "Yeah, I'm not going to go to. I'm going to go to Top Dog. I'm going to ask the publisher for a raise." And I got bumped up to $210 a week. It felt like a major victory. But I went
Yeah.
from there. I went to the Time Inc. in New York. I went to the old Washington Star, and came to the Baltimore Sun. Went to the Washington Post for where I was for over 20 years, and now I'm at ESPN. If you would have asked me, Michael, you think that's going to be your path? If you would have asked me that in 1980, 1981, 1979, I would say that's a very ambitious thing. Man. I don't know about all of that, but it happened not because I was somebody's brilliant, journalist. I think I do a good job, but I think it was my just sort of willingness to persevere, to kind of work through the steps. And every job has value in the newsroom. I've done night meetings, county government. I think sometimes these kind of apprenticeship jobs are valuable. You kind of
Mhm.
make your victories are celebrated, but your mistakes are a little bit under notice, which is probably good too early, early on. But you keep chugging, you keep moving, you keep pushing ahead, and I think eventually there'll be some level of success. I know so many people who quit the business, and I think who were talented, but because they didn't get a certain promotion or they didn't get
Mhm.
this or they didn't get that. In the newsroom, it's like it probably. I haven't had other workplaces, but I'm sure it's like everywhere else. Like favorites get promoted. Uh, a lot of things are based on relationships. I mean, it's life, right? But for the most part, if you're good, that eventually will be, I think, will be recognized. I feel
Mhm.
like it will be. So I tell young journalists, first of all, write, read, 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 but persevere and persist. And I think, what you want will come your way.
That is great advice for everyone, not just journalists, not just young people, but I think having the tenacity and perseverance to kind of um, stick with something you're passionate about and also to take full advantage of everything that you have right in front of you.
Right.
Because it's all a microcosm for something a little bit bigger. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming to talk with me. This has been terrific, and I really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Take care.
You too. Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.